Well, as the clock continues to tick, Trump's legal team is immersed in a frenzy of activity, and the motivation behind their mad dash to cause legal bedlam, well, that's what's making breaking news today on MSNBC, as Lisa Rubin and Joyce Vance drop by Morning Joe to join the gang and deep dive into Donald Trump's legal lackey's dark determination to find a way to foul our election process. And they speculate on what might just lurk in Jack Smith's 2020 election interference documents based on Judge Chutkan's earlier request denial. Well, what's in there that Trump so desperately doesn't want voters to see? Well, let's see what it might be.
Joining us now, former litigator and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin and former U.S. attorney and MSNBC legal analyst Joyce Vance. She is a co-host of the Sisters-in-Law podcast, which I love. Joyce, I'll start with you with what is going on in Georgia and what are the bigger implications? Are people going to start hearing these stories and think their vote's not going to count?
So that's exactly the risk here, and possibly that's the plan. There are a variety of attacks underway on Georgia's elections. Many of them are coming from within. For instance, one of the cases, Adams, was filed by one of the superintendents who's charged with counting and protecting and certifying Georgia's elections. And so far, the courts have been resilient, giving a firm message back that says, we mean it when we say you can't make changes to these elections too close to Election Day, because that would cause chaos. So look, Mika, the real risk here is that voters will hear some of these stories, see about the 120-plus lawsuits that the RNC has filed nationwide, and they'll begin to question the integrity of our elections. And the answer is this. Our elections are conducted across the country in a very decentralized way by highly trained, dedicated people, many of them volunteers. And in state after state, we've seen officials say, we've looked at our machinery, we've conducted our training, we are confident in the process. And that's the message Americans should take away, not these lawsuits raising claims that aren't true, that end up being rejected by the courts. But that, of course, takes a little bit of time.
So, Lisa, let's get your analysis here on the rulings, decisions yesterday, and also what it means for voters in just a few weeks' time.
Well, I would say, John, one of the things it means for voters is a restoration of the status quo. In other words, before the Georgia Election Board sought fit to alter the election rules, people should have felt secure that their votes were going to count, and they should still feel secure that their votes are going to count, because the ruling, there are a series of rulings in Georgia this week. Joyce was talking about one of them. There's another one that invalidated 7 different rules of the Georgia Election Board. And one of the things that the judge is trying to make clear is only the state legislature has the power to change the time, place, and manner for electing federal officials. They can't delegate that to something like the Georgia Election Board, and the Georgia Election Board overstepped. They overreached when they tried to change the rules of the game, not only so late in the game, but even if they had done this 2 to 3 years ago, by his reasoning, this wouldn't have been permissible.
I have a question for Joyce, which is, are Republicans and the plaintiffs in these cases, are they going to appeal? And is there any possibility that this ruling, for example, could be reversed before the election?
Sure. So I think we'll absolutely see these appeals take place. That's always part of the strategy when you litigate this close to Election Day. Part of that process involves trying to get last-ditch appeals through. But we're now too close to the election, Gene, for that to happen. We've already seen DOJ step in 2 states, in Alabama and Virginia, where the state was trying to remove voters from the election rolls, claiming some of those people might be non-citizens who weren't eligible to vote. It turned out in Alabama, we've already had a quick ruling forcing the state to restore those voters to active voter status, because it turns out they are eligible to vote. And so increasingly, the appellate courts will say it's too late for these pre-election measures to change the rules on the ground. But of course, that doesn't mean there won't be litigation after the election, too. And Americans need to understand that that's the strategy, going to the courts to challenge. Some challenges are legitimate. Candidates are entitled to ask for vote counts if they think an election is close and there might be a problem. That goes on all the time, and that's fine. But what we shouldn't take away from any of this is that there's a fundamental problem with our elections, because there isn't. Every American will be able to vote and have their vote counted, and the courts will step in to protect that.
Lisa, let's talk about what's going on in the check-in court here, where the Trump team tried to block some evidence from coming into the public purview, and the judge basically very quickly said, "No, that evidence is coming out from the appendix in the Smith filing." Talk a little bit about what we might be likely to see there.
You know, I'm not sure, John, how much we're going to see there, because the Department of Justice was very plain in saying they want to protect witnesses, for example, to the extent that somebody has given testimony that's non-public. We're not likely to see the substance of that testimony beyond the way in which it's been quoted in the brief already. How much will we see today? That's unclear. My own expectations are fairly low. On the other hand, you have the Trump team fighting tooth and nail to prevent this disclosure. They got their ruling last Thursday. They asked for more time to evaluate their litigation options. Then they waited until the 11th hour, and instead of trying to get a ruling from an appeals court, which they didn't have the right to do, their only real option was to ask Judge Chutkan, as they did yesterday, continue this stay through November 14th. So you have to ask yourself, why are they fighting so hard if what we're about to see isn't really all that surprising? There's probably something in there that they don't want the voting public to know about or see in a more fulsome way. So I'll be looking forward to flipping through those 1,600 plus pages later today.
Wow. Thank you for doing that, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. Thank you both very much for explaining that all.
Well, all news is good news if it minimizes Trump's rumored plan to round up all the indigenous people in North America and send them back to wherever the hell they came from, so that we can all, us, enjoy a great American Thanksgiving again. Okay, I made that up, but it makes just as much sense as anything that's come falling out of his gaping maw in the past month.